You're listening to Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories, a podcast that celebrates the wisdom, courage, experience, and joy of individuals in the queer community. Every week, we feature a guest who has a remarkable story to tell about their coming out and the life they've lived beyond. Now here's your host, Anne-Marie Zansel.
I'm excited to welcome to my show today Amanda Ferrat, who is the founder of Value Yourself Counseling, a certified advanced EFT Tapping Practioner, wellness counselor, and international speaker. Over the last 2 decades, Amanda supported others to meet various needs in the field of human development and social services, including those in crisis or healing from trauma. Amanda now helps women and teens that feel lost or out of sync with themselves get back to a place of deep self-knowing, unburdened by guilt or shame. Amanda supports them on their journey to empower their inner badness. I like the little trademark by that. By combining her empathy, knowledge, lived experience, passion, and professional skills to create safer, braver spaces for deeper healing and personal growth. Amanda identifies as a fat, queer, neurodivergent, disabled woman and wants to show the world that those with marginalized identities deserve to be seen, heard, and safe within their communities. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to hear your story. So, Amanda, can you tell me your story?
Sure. So growing up, I grew up in small town Montana with fairly conservative family members and always kind of knew I was a little bit of the black sheep, right? A little more liberal, a little more outspoken about certain things. And so I like to say I have over 30 years of activism because I've been an activist since I was a child. And growing up, like obviously in conservative Montana, anything having to do with the LGBTQ community. Of course, back then it was just gay or queer, right? And of course, those words were not used in positive manners. I always had this interesting draw to the word queer, but never could put my finger on it because I just didn't have the knowledge or the wherewithal. Fast forward many years later, and I, looking back, I've always had this collection of kind of outlier friends and ended up in kind of outlier, interesting relationships. But I worked in human services and social services, and I decided to pursue my master's of social work. And unfortunately, life had other plans. I suffered a great number of losses in a really short span while in grad school and got to a point where I wasn't having any space to take care of myself, do my own self-care, meet my needs. And life imploded as it does when you don't have time or space to take care of yourself. And so I got to take kind of a sabbatical and take time to take care of myself. And of course, things got worse before they got better. But as I was coming out of that, through really good self-care and, doing the work, I realized, okay, there's all these layers to kind of who I am now that I've gotten to take time to kind of sit with myself. And as I reintegrated back into society, because I basically become agoraphobic and had horrible social anxiety and was fairly isolated, I was like, how do I get myself back into the world? And so I was ready to become a self-care and grief coach, and I was getting back out there, and then the pandemic hit. So we all had to turn back in and turn to online. And so in that, I found all these different places and spaces. And I was learning new modalities. That's how I found EFT tapping and became a tapping practitioner. But in all of that, I also was part of a women's group. And in one of our group sessions online, we were supposed to be painting pumpkins and talking about Halloween, which is my favorite holiday. And somebody joined the call. They didn't have a pumpkin to paint. And they just started talking about, a lot of their most recent kind of dating drama. And I just realized like I had this really big visceral reaction. And I got off the call and I was just like, what is this? Where is this coming from? And I realized it's because I had the little inner voice, right, screaming at me. It's because you're done with cisgender, heteronormative. I'm like, whoa, what does that mean? Thankfully, I had taken a sexuality and gender course in grad school.
Well, that's why you had that language, right? Because if you
Right.
hadn't, you would not have used that language. You'd be like, oh,
Exactly.
that's right.
Right. So I had the privilege of access to higher education that had, given me some resources. So I had saved a lot of my stuff from grad school, and I went and found that folder and started digging through things and again, turning to online. And I was like, oh, I'm queer. Hence why I've always had this like pull or draw to the word, but knew that if I ever tried to even talk about that word, I would have been shut down having grown up in Montana. And so I just kept leaning in and getting curious. And I realized, okay, more specifically, I'm gray arrow ace, aromantic and asexual. Because I just have no desire to have relationships with anybody at this point, because let's be honest, the world is just too chaotic and I just don't have time for that. And I was like, and I don't know that when I go back to having relationships, that it's gonna be a cis heteronormative relationship. Like
Mhm.
I finally was like, okay. And since then, I have realized that there's a reason I love Law and Order SVU. I have a crush on Olivia Benson. And like there's other things, right, that have come about. And so tying that back to then becoming a practitioner, right, as an advanced EFT practitioner and wellness counselor and somebody who does activism, I now help other people kind of unpack and go through those layers of shedding shame and guilt, getting down to identity roots, going back and doing the inner child work, right? So that we can show up fully, authentically as our inner badass selves and live a life that feels aligned, authentic, and safe.
Mhm. Mhm. So I want you to do some education for
Yes.
my listeners. So gray arrow ace. Can you break those down and tell them what they mean? Because I'm just curious. What does it mean? I mean, I
Yeah.
know what it means, but I want you to explain it. I don't know the
Right.
gray, though. You've stumped me on the gray. I haven't heard that one.
So gray basically means that there's gray area because all
Ah,
my previous relationships were cis hetero, like normative relations, meaning I, a cisgender woman, was dating cisgender men.
mhm.
The gray area also is if I do go back to dating, I don't know whether that will be with men or with women or gender non-conforming. There's that gray area. So the aromantic is I have no desire, like there's no romantic attraction when I see other people. It just isn't there. I have no desire for romantic relationships. I don't have that kind of connection or attachment with anyone. Um, Asexual just means, again, I don't have any desire for sexual intimacy relationships at this point. I joke that I have a crush on Olivia Benson because unhuman, right? Like there's moments of attraction or like I know what somebody looks like and I can say, oh, I think they're cute or I think they're beautiful or I can appreciate the human form, but it goes nowhere beyond that. It's just like, nope, don't have the time, energy, or desire for those things right now. And to be quite honest, it makes life so much less complicated
So why do you say that? I'm just curious.
because I get to focus on me.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also that part of I now no longer have that internal struggle going on. I can say the word queer and I know what that means for me and it fits and it feels good. And I'm not ashamed to date that I identify as such. And I use queer primarily simply because it's easier. Gray arrow ace isn't widely known and there is, education that needs to happen. And I don't always want to do that emotional labor of having to explain what that means because I've had harm
Absolutely.
done around that. And therefore, queer not only feels better, but it also is sometimes easier. But it's also easier because I don't have to worry about a partner or the dating drama. I look at the dating world and people that are out there actively dating, I'm in my mid 40s and I'm just like, oh, I'm so glad I'm okay with where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
Because I realized a lot of why I didn't realize that my pull to the word queer was because I identified as queer, because I was so wrapped up in societal and familial programming to pursue a relationship with a man because women got married and had babies. And that's
Oh,
what
absolutely. And it's interesting. Uh, it's still taught today, right? I mean,
Right.
I work with people coming out later in life. Generally, most of my people identify either as bisexual or lesbian. And it doesn't matter. The youngest people I work with are 25 and the oldest people are 75 plus. And the same patriarchal notions that a woman should get married and have babies and, is is still widely held. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's desired. I really desired to have children. Now I don't know if it was such a great idea. I hope my kids never listen to this. They drive me crazy. But I mean, I sort of really wanted that. And so wanted to get married and do all those things. But being married to me to a man was not fulfilling in any sense of
Right.
the word. And now I'm married to my wife, and it is so different and so much more fulfilling than I ever dreamed possible. So tell me a little bit about your work that you do with your clients. And also too, so this is all post-pandemic. You do realize that a lot of people had this realization in the pandemic. That they're not cis heterosexual people, that I understand too about that draw for the word queer. I use queer for myself. Now, my wife's who's been out since she was, in her 20s, and I'm 59, she's 60. She has resistance towards that word. Not that she doesn't use it, but I love the word queer because I consider myself like the class of 2016 in coming out. So even though I came out older, I'm still queer in the sense that the values I hold are often the same values as somebody who's come out in the mid-teens. And you also, too, I hear it in your language, like
Yes.
even in the last 7 years, how much the language is advanced, and one thing we both know about the queer community is the language is ever changing and
Yes.
ever evolving. So what kind of work do you do as a coach? And who is your ideal client?
So for me, it is, women kind of middle age having that epiphany of my life just doesn't fit anymore. But I don't know how to get back to either what I wanted it to be or what it's meant to be now. And so they are feeling that, they're either living in survival mode, right? Of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or constantly just in stress and activation, or they're burnt out and overwhelmed, or just that sense of detachment from self. And just really having that desire for something more, but still trying to figure out what steps to take and how to make that happen. And they know that like shame or guilt or patriarchal programming is definitely a piece of that, or childhood wounding, those kinds of things. And then also, I love working with teens, kind of help save them, right, from having to come back and do some of the work. And so teaching them that self advocacy and how to kind of set healthy boundaries and gain autonomy in a way that, you know, I try to be Switzerland because I remember what it's like growing up and having parents that never would have understood if I would have come to them first. So I know what it's like to, beg for forgiveness instead of ask for permission first. And what I try to do with teens is, no, this is how you do self advocate so that there is a healthy relationship between yourself and your parents or guardians. And this is how you navigate those situations that are a little trickier or stickier or uncomfortable. Just so that they can, again, have that autonomy and start their life as young adults living unburdened by patriarchal programming or shame or guilt. Because what I see, I'm also the co-chair of the Tillamook County Suicide Prevention Coalition here in Tillamook, Oregon, where I live. And I am super passionate about suicide prevention.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, our community is at higher risk, not because of our identity, but because of the harm we face by others who don't understand or accept our identity. And so for teens, it's especially important that they have resources and supports. And so I want to be an active resource and support to help hopefully actively do suicide prevention by showing youth how to navigate identity issues within familial and societal structures.
How do they find you? I can understand a 40-something-year-old woman saying, okay, I need help on this. I'm going to find somebody that, fits who I want to work with. But how do you
Right.
work with the teens?
either through adults that kind of learn about me and plug me into places. Like I've been a guest speaker in homeschool groups, mental health clubs for high schools. I'm currently getting, into my different communities here in Tillamook. And one of the ways I'm doing that is I'm actually throwing a queer prom, and we are including teens. I've had teens find me through doing tabling at events. Like I've been at an energy healing event and found some youth that way. So there's various avenues, but mostly it's through like adult referrals or people finding me online. Is just kind of typically the easiest route.
So you said you do a lot of work with shame.
Yes.
Talk about that, because as somebody who, I do a lot of work with shame as well. I'm a big Brene Brown fan. Though
Yes.
her early work is white people shame, and then she's evolved. She's an incredible teacher, and she has evolved because I remember reading her first book. I can't remember the name right off the top of my head, but when she first really talks about shame, and she's talking about not bringing cookies to her kids, like not forgetting to bring cookies to her kids, and it was like, oh, I understand that because I've been that person, but I also was like, oh gosh, on the top of all the shame that there is in the world, this is so not huge, but it's also a deeper, shame. Like when we feel shame about something, it's also something quite deeper. How do you work with people with shame? Because it's hard, because people don't want to go there. And how do you lead them there? Or how do you walk with them? Or how do you work with that?
Right. So I like to joke that I'm the badass of holding compassionate spaces, because I like those really dark, deep, hard spaces, because I've been there. And unfortunately, in those spaces, I was often very much alone and would have given anything for somebody else that was able to be in those places and spaces with me, but people weren't. And so I am somebody that is, I'm trauma informed. I have a background in social work, and I've got the lived experience. And so I just put those together and do my best to meet people right where they're at, and then just very gently handhold and kind of guide people through. And tapping is a great tool, because really the client is doing the work. I am as the practitioner, I'm just creating the space and leading you through. But we follow your language, we follow your emotions, we follow your memories that come up. And so it's all about just really, and I'm also super empathic and intuitive. So that does not hurt at all, having those gifts and skills to kind of tune in and be that mirror, right? So if I'm kind of picking up on a different read than what somebody's wanting to show me, and I'm picking up on something else, that very gentle mirror of, well, this is what I'm seeing. How does that land? And, again, it's just, people just want to be seen, heard, and done so in a safe way. And so creating that container where they can fall apart and that it is okay. And I'm not going to go anywhere, right, until they're ready to kind of move on to the next step. And the modality of tapping that I am trained and certified in is wonderful, because we are trained. If our subconscious, we start to do everything with tapping that calms everything down, and our subconscious will bring things up. And sometimes we're like, ooh, okay, I wasn't ready for that. That's a little deeper or darker than I can handle today. I'm trained to kind of help you put that away, pack it back up, set it aside until you're ready to go there, so that we don't re-trauma or re-trigger anything, for people. Because of course, I don't want to make you feel worse before I can help you make you feel better. I want to walk through with you, making it a much more smooth transition.
Well, and I'm sure people feel safe with you because you let them put it away instead of saying, we've got to go through this right now. Because sometimes you're not. You're just not ready to do some work. In fact, with my own therapist, there was some work I needed to do. And she goes, do you want to do that? And I said, not yet. I said, maybe one day we'll come in session and I'll have what you need. We were doing grief recovery work from the grief recovery workbook. Have you ever seen that? It's a great workbook. And so we were doing some work with that. And she goes, do you want to write your letters? I'm like, no, not yet. Because part of the recovery is to write letters to the people.
Right.
And I'm like, no, not yet. But because the person I'm grieving is still alive. And so I'm like, No, not yet. But one day you may show up and I may show up and have the letters written, but I don't want to go there right now because it's too painful and
Right.
I'm not ready. I'm just not ready yet. So what is like, okay, I've heard about tapping a lot. What is tapping? And can you give like such a basic example for someone who just wants to try it on themselves as a like curiosity?
Right.
If possible.
So yeah. So EFT tapping, EFT stands for emotional freedom techniques. And it's a combination of Western and Eastern practices. So the Eastern practices are that you tap on various acupressure meridian points on your body. And you do that while kind of walking through some talk therapy, neuro-linguistic programming type language. And so people can do it by themselves. There are tons of YouTubes and TikToks and all sorts of apps and things out there. The benefit of doing tapping with a practitioner is that we're going to, again, be able to hold up that mirror, walk you through the process in a way that honors whatever emotions are showing up. Because we as humans, if we do things on our own, we want it to be a neat, pretty little linear process, and we might bypass and like gaslight ourselves right into skipping whatever emotionally might need to be dealt with. But it's a super easy tool. I like to start the easiest thing you can start doing, and it doesn't even require any of the talk therapy piece, is just tapping on your fingers. So you can literally take 2 fingers from your one hand, tap along the nail bed on the side of your nail fingers along the nail bed of your other hand. And you just tap a few times, move to the next finger, and just keep repeating that. And this can be done, under the desk or table. I did it. I was recently in court for something and was nervous because I was representing myself. And so I was tapping under the table while I sat there in the courtroom. I've done it in traffic with one hand. I will remove a hand from the steering wheel and use my thumb to tap alongside on the other fingers.
So
Because what,
yeah,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay, so what's the purpose?
So what that does is the tapping on those acupressure meridian points, whether it's on your fingers or on your body, what that does is it sends signals to the limbic system, the amygdala, those parts of your brain that are in charge of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that are in charge of pumping out the stress hormones and doing all the things that our brain is hardwired to do to keep us safe, yet isn't always truly helpful in the long run. And it tells all of those systems, calm down. And then we can move into a rest and repose state and access our parasympathetic nervous system. And so we go from the activated state to a rest and recovery state. What that also does takes us from primal brain to our higher developed frontal lobe, where we can make decisions with clarity and conviction and not just be reacting. We can actually take some time to formulate a response. So that reduces impulsivity, aggression, and those kinds of things, because we've got that higher thinking that we now have access to.
So I used to be a big practitioner of Kundalini yoga. Do you know, have you
Yes.
ever, yeah. So one of the mudras is Satanama, which is basically the same thing. You're not on the side of your hand, you're on the things, but when you are using mudra, and I'm touching for those who are listening, I'm touching my thumb to each one of my fingers, and you do Satanama, which is birth, life, death, rebirth. That's what that means. And it's mudra and again, Eastern philosophy, where I'm touching the tips. And it really does. For years, I would do that when I was anxious about something, and I wasn't practicing at that point. But when as you can see, Amanda's
Right.
nodding her head. I can do it really fast because I think it's this. It sounds like it's the same principle, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And so, there's tapping points. So the side of our hands, that's where we do our setup phrases at the start of a round of tapping. Then there's the top of your head, which if you drew a line from your nose up and your ears up, where that met is top of the head point. Then there's the eyebrow point, which is not right above the center of the eyebrow, but more above kind of your nose at the start of your eyebrows.
yeah, and you.
Yeah. And then there's side of the eye, which is out from the corner of your eye. Under your eye, which is right there. I've got my nice little cheek sinus bones there. Under the nose, the chin, and then collarbone, which isn't right on the collarbone, but about an inch below. And that point can be kind of sensitive for some folks, but it's one of my favorite spots. And then under the arms, which is kind of awkward. And I don't like to do it when I'm on camera because I look like a funky chicken. But for us ladies, it would be kind of where our bra bands hit under our arms. And then the chest, which is also another awkward one, but kind of right under the breasts, or I go right in the center, and then wrist point. And I'll teach another little trick. So if you find yourself getting activated and you're getting kind of riled up, or the anxiety is creeping in, or any kind of big emotion is showing up, you can put your hand over your heart, your left hand over your heart, and your fingers will kind of land right at that tapping point there. And so you're putting your hand over your heart, so you're kind of coming back into your body, and then you're tapping that tapping point right there. And that will start to help you reground into your body and calm down. And it, again, is another way to kind of do it inconspicuously. And you're just
no one would actually, you could be sitting there looking like you're thinking about something,
right.
And nobody would know, like you have a big meeting or something like that and you're really anxious.
Yes.
You know, people like these things are so important for people, and they're so, I think people are just rediscovering all these things, or this is fairly new. I've heard of tapping in the last, I guess, 10 years or so. How do you incorporate it in your grief work?
I'm glad you brought up grief, because grief is another umbrella of what I do. I have taught and used grief because grief, again, right? We like things to be linear, and there's the stages of grief. Those were for those that were in active death and dying, but we've adapted them now to grief, and there's new stages.
Gosh, you're a good person. I say that all the time. I'm like, they just took them up and placed them on them. And I'm just going to say very quickly that for my women that I work with coming out later in life, those 5 stages are often very similar because they're dying to a sense of self.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that's the identity work that I do, because there is grief in like identity loss. And it's one of the types of loss we really do not talk about. And so grief brings up really big emotions. And they come on sometimes out of nowhere. Part of why I ended up actually mildly agoraphobic was because I wasn't addressing my grief enough or in the right ways. And I would be out in public and something would trigger my grief unexpectedly. And I would literally be falling apart. And people in our culture here in America don't know what to do with that. So when you're losing it in Target, literally bawling suddenly as the overhead music shifts to something, or you see or smell something that triggers your grief, nobody knows what to do with that. And they get really weird and they get really scared. And then you are even more isolated and feel even more awkward. So those are the moments where tapping and grief go perfectly. Also, memories. If you said some of the people you're grieving are still alive, I know what that feels like. And that is so hard, as well as like anticipatory grief, right? These griefs where there's like something lost, but not a person, or they're still alive, right? These weird areas where grief, there's so much gray area. And tapping can help us go in and kind of look at those memories or those relationships and rework our emotions around those things so that we get better centered and have more calm or peace around those things. And I know for me, a lot of my grief work, the three of the humans that I lost in a very short span were 3 humans who would have a hard time with me being who I am now. They were 3 that kind of pushed back on my young activism. And so there's some of that reconciliation for me that has to happen. And so that's another way to use tapping, is just for me to center back in and not, again, slip into that shame, right? Because shame shows up when there's unmet expectations or expectations don't align. And so, right, that old messaging shows up of, grandma wouldn't approve, or grandpa would be mad at this, or my dad would have this to say. And I can tap in and be like, yes, but 44-year-old Amanda is okay right here, right now. And this is what I want. And this is what I need. And I'm accessing my higher self and my inner badass, as I call it, and coming from that place instead of, wounded or hurt little inner Amanda that is carrying all the shame around, things that.
And I also think too, is that is that those people you mentioned, we're all acculturated a certain way. And so I always like to think that people go to their higher self when they like the conditioning of this life, growing up in Montana, and I'm sure your loved ones grew up there. It's a certain kind of life. That's a lifestyle.
I
that for me, who's from New England and lives in the South now, to me, big sky country, that whole like rancher kind of vibe. I don't know, that's
yes,
what I see on TV. I may be totally off. But like, there's a certain mindset of how you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to live your life. And so when I feel like people pass on, I often think that, like, for example, like, I don't know if you've done this work with those loved ones, but like my parents who were, really just, they were pretty, it was an abusive childhood, but because of their own shit they were going through,
right.
and I find that it's easier to forgive them once somebody's gone
Yes.
because they can't hurt you anymore, right? And
Yeah.
so I have sort of learned that I always think of them moving to their higher self when they move on, and they're not the same person that we knew here on earth. And I know, like, those people who work with spirit guides and stuff like that, spirit guides are often like cheering us on, you
Right.
go girl, you go do that.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up. So I remember I've had a couple conversations with folks where you kind of, at least for us, we'd have these moments where the path of how those people that had passed show up for us, right? And they have that moment of, they show up, there's that raw moment of it's that raw loss, right? Shortly after the loss, and they show up very differently. And then there's kind of, for me, with my dad is who I've felt it the most with, my dad and my mom's mom. For my dad, he showed up really heavy in like dreams and things, and other in ways kind of as his old self a little bit, but like there was some of that noticeable. And then he kind of disappeared for a little while. There was a period of time where he was sending us guitar picks, actually, from beyond. He played guitar and wrote his own music. And my mom and I, between us, we found 3 guitar picks at
Mhm.
very like pivotal, poignant moments. Um, and then it kind of got quiet. And then for me, he's kind of shown back up, and there is this transformation that I feel in his spirit, in that it's like he's gained some understanding that some of that fear and the ignorance and the things that kind of fueled, the discord in our relationship, in those moments where there was discord, have faded away again, because he has accessed this higher self
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
the beyond. And so now he does show up as somebody cheering me on, and as somebody that feels safe and is an ally. um I don't feel that way necessarily with my grandparents that were my dad's parents. Unfortunately, I don't think they're there yet. I think they're a little more stubborn. I think they've got their heels dug in a little bit more. But my dad did pass at 62, and my grandparents passed in their 80s. So, they had a little more living on this earth, and think therefore are a little more dug in. But I'm hoping they get there. My mom's mom, also same thing, has kind of shown up and feels like a spirit guide that has my back. And I had a past life reading done. I don't know if you're into these things. It was super powerful. And the person that was doing it said there were 7 past lives that showed up, but 3 of them were like screaming to be shown and spoken to. And she goes, and you've also got a lot of ancestors showing up. She's like, you got a lot of people here cheering you on. And I was like, feels good, because when you grow up, you know, my grandparents told, don't you dare get your name in the paper unless it's for something good,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
don't you go get in the family name in trouble.
Especially if you're an
Pretty recognizable last name.
well, and also especially if you were an activist in parts of the world that they were not comfortable with,
Right.
because a lot of us, it was really interesting to me, Amanda, when I came out. Um, I found a Facebook group, and that was really what changed everything. And it took me like 10 years to come out. It wasn't like a one-time static thing and done. And I've come out constantly, all the time too. But when I found that Facebook group, all of a sudden I saw all these people saying the same things that I had always thought to myself. And all of a sudden, I had community because I was so isolated before. And then I started to become friends with these people on Facebook, and they all had very similar Facebook walls that I did, that were very tend to be, more on the progressive side of politics, tend to be very concerned about civil rights, justice, all those things. And I didn't like, and so then I was also like, okay, so but here I am, a woman of like privilege. I'm white. I had relatively
Right.
wealth. I was married. I mean, I was at the height of privilege in the United States, which is being white for a woman, white, married, and wealthy. I mean, that's about
Right.
as, and I was a minister. So, I mean, I was pretty privileged out there. And I always wondered, like, why did I have such a heart for marginalized communities? And then it dawned on me that inside of myself, like you were talking about, you realized, oh, because I'm marginalized, as you have all those intersections,
Right.
but I'm marginal. I had that heart because I felt very, very, very alone inside.
Yes.
And everything I did up to that point was pretty performative. Some things I wanted, but also too, but very performative of, getting the good career, getting, doing all
Yep.
those things. And yet inside of myself, I was dying. And when I finally entered the queer community fully, um, I all of a sudden had community in a way
Yeah.
that I never had before. So, for example, Saturday I went to a soccer game with a bunch of friends, all of them four or five lesbians, two very affirming straight people, straight, all women. When I was living my straight life, I never wanted, like, going somewhere with a group of women to go shopping. I would rather kill myself. Just that- and so I didn't have
Right.
friendships like that because it just didn't, I just wasn't interested. And
Right.
then now here I'm doing this stuff that I'm like sort of surprised. Here in my late 50s, I'm going out with groups of women and having a blast, which I never did before because I was always sort of isolated, because I was isolated in my queerness in my heteronormative life. And I see you nodding your head, so
Yeah.
am I preaching to the choir?
Well, and it's just, so I currently live in Tillamook, Oregon, which is a coastal farm town, very conservative. And yet we're about an hour and a half outside of Portland, which is
Very
not so conservative. And I lived in Portland prior to moving here, but I kind of came full circle, right? I was ready to be done with city life and I wanted something that was close enough to like how I grew up, but not quite as, not the same, right? And still wanted to be close enough to a big city. So Tillamook was perfect. And I'm 10 minutes from the ocean. Can't beat that. And yet, as I've been planning this queer prom and living more fully into my queerness and just my identity and showing up in all the parts of myself, um, and have joined some local boards here and kind of just really making a home for myself, because part of why I left Portland was there was harm done around some of my identities and my spaces and my community there, and it just wasn't a fit anymore. So I came here and was like, okay, I can kind of tuck away and isolate. And then when I was ready, I just, in the last year, I've really kind of put myself out there. And of course, in the last couple of weeks in this planning, I've had some pushback from some local folks that obviously have very different views and opinions than myself. And all it does is add fuel to my fire. My goal is actually to form Tillamook Pride as a nonprofit organization here in our county for folks that are in our community, and are feeling isolated and oppressed and marginalized. And I've been getting some really beautiful emails from folks, that are so thankful that I'm doing this work, and I'm not doing it alone. I have some great volunteers behind me, and we are just committed to showing that we are in all communities and that we deserve to be seen and heard and safe. And, we aren't just in big progressive cities like Portland or Seattle or other places. And we aren't something new that Gen Xers made up, that LGBTQ has always been a community. Again, we're just, learning, growing, progressing in our language and our talking about it. And we're trying to take the word queer back and take power back in talking about things and destigmatizing and shifting the power dynamics. And it's been a really interesting few weeks for me here in Tillamook. And I'm actually going home to Montana next week for my nephew's graduation. He's graduating college. He went to the college I went to. And I'm actually a little fearful to go home because I've never been this out. I've gone home a few times since I've came out, but I came out mostly to my family and then, on my Facebook page and things, but I'm not, spending time around these people. And my nephew's obviously having a graduation party and I will be showing up and be around a lot of people that haven't seen me since I've been out. And they ask me what I'm doing. I'm not going to mask or hide myself. And I'm building my business in Tillamook. I'm planning a queer party. I'm going to be real because I'm tired of masking myself. I've worn a mask for way too long. And I kind of joked with somebody the other day, the only way I will be quiet is if my brother writes me a great big fat check and buys my silence. And even then, I don't think that could happen, but my bank account wouldn't mind. I joke, but really it's this, we're constantly trying to figure out, where am I safe? Where am I not? How much of myself can I show? And that's what I'm pushing back against in all my work, is that we get to unmask and live life safely and just be seen, heard, valued, and treated with dignity and respect. And that we have access to community, we have access to care, and just basic human decency.
Right. And dignity. Absolutely.
Yes.
So Amanda, little firebrand, do you have a coming out song? I saw it was a link. I didn't click it because I couldn't do it quick enough. But what was that?
So I love Meghan Trainor's Badass Woman.
Okay.
And it's just because it's all about not playing small anymore and getting to show up as you are and just no apologies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. Do you have a book or something or a movie that you've seen that has really changed your perspective on things?
I'm 44 and my favorite movie still to this day is Labyrinth. David Bowie will always be my Goblin King. And I look back and my love of David Bowie and Prince and other people that some of those gender conformity boundaries, right? I'm just oh, now I get it. So not that Labyrinth has been a change, but watching it now through the lens of an adult, right? That's lived and had the experience I've had. I'm like, okay, 8-year-old Amanda, I get it.
Well, that's
so get it.
So Matrix, first time I watched it, I didn't do anything for me. And then the second time I watched it, I was out. I had, and also knew and have tons of trans friends and knows the director is a trans woman. And I watched it again and I was like, oh, and I love that movie now. The first time I watched, and my wife watched it with me too, and we both really, really liked about the message about breaking free from the pods and all those things that. And I really understand that on a much deeper level than when I watched it the first time and thought, and I was sort of it's okay, because it was really big when it first came out. How do you describe your life today since this acknowledgement of who you are?
It has just thrown fuel on my activist fire, and advocate fire. I, now recognize as a wellness professional, the platform that I have to be an advocate for wellness, access to care, suicide prevention, etc. I am motivated to create safer spaces for those of us that hold oppressed or marginalized identities. And the more fully I show up as myself, the more it gives permission to show others to show up authentically as themselves. And I just want to keep pushing against those boundaries. And I'm doing it here in this little tiny town that I live in. And so life for me, while there's parts of it that look scary, like going home to Montana, there are parts that look really, really good and are, as I'm realizing, absolutely full of rainbows. I know that might be a little bit cheesy, but literally just, it feels like there's just, these prisms of color and hope and new possibility and continued learning and growth. And it's really exciting.
Well, Amanda Ferrat, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your story, and I really love the work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
You've been listening to Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA Plus Stories with Anne-Marie Zanzel. New episodes of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast drop every other Friday. You can tune in at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at annemariezanzel.com. Be sure to hit subscribe when tuning in so you never miss an episode. And for more resources, articles, videos, and a free downloadable guide for coming out later in life, visit annemariezanzel.com.